Night of the Mist. Chapter 1. The aroma of roasted coffee beans and garlic-infused olive oil was the lifeblood of Franco's, a sanctuary of warmth against the biting winter winds of Samhain, Maine. Franco Martel, a man whose handsome 40-year-old face was as comforting as his food, polished the worn mahogany bar. His dark hair was slicked back, and his impossibly blue eyes scanned the familiar late-afternoon crowd. At a corner table, Agios Sophia, a private investigator with the easy grin and coiled energy of the ex-stuntman he was, regaled a pair of old fishermen with a story that was likely 90% fiction. His laughter boomed, a welcome sound in the quiet diner. In a booth by the window, Ronald Richardson, a recent transplant from England, sat ramrod straight, his dapper suit a stark contrast to the worn work clothes of the other patrons. He nursed a single espresso, his gaze fixed on a leather-bound book, an air of genteel mystery clinging to him like expensive cologne. The bell above the door chimed, and Officer Fernanda Vasquez stepped in, shaking the cold from her police-issued greatcoat. Her dark hair was pinned in a severe bun, but it couldn't tame the fierce beauty of her features or the warmth in her eyes as she saw Franco. "Evening, boss," she said, her Spanish accent softening the words. "Still making the best cannoli in New England?" "Only for my favorite ex-waitress," Franco replied, his own Italian accent a rich, melodic counterpoint. "You look tired, Fernanda. The streets of Samhain giving you trouble?" "Just the usual," she sighed, sliding onto a bar stool. "Kids stealing pies from windowsills, old Mrs. Gable complaining about phantom cats again. I'll take a coffee, black." Before Franco could turn to the machine, the bell chimed again. This time, the man who entered seemed to suck the warmth from the room. He was tall and gaunt, with greasy, lank hair that clung to a pale, narrow face. His eyes, small and dark, darted around the room, settling on nothing and everything at once. He wore a threadbare coat that was too thin for the weather, and moved with a shuffling, unnatural gait. He slid into the darkest, most distant booth nestled beneath a stairway, and simply sat there, watching. Agios's story faltered. The fisherman shifted uncomfortably. Even Ronald Richardson looked up from his book, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "Who's that?" Fernanda murmured, her cop's intuition humming, not to mention her irritation. The stranger had just sat in her favorite seat. "Never seen him," Franco said, his hands busy pouring her coffee. "He gives me a bad feeling," he called out, his voice forcibly cheerful. "Welcome to Franco's. What can I get for you, sir?" The man didn't answer. He just stared, a faint, unsettling smirk playing on his thin lips. They called him Sameth. He hadn't introduced himself. The name had just seemed to arrive with him, a whisper on the cold draft he'd brought inside. It was then that they first noticed the mist. Samhain was a town perpetually draped in fog from the nearby coast and winding rivers. But this was different. It wasn't the gentle, gray blanket they knew. This was a thick, bilious, yellow-gray soup that pressed against the diner's large plate-glass windows, obscuring the familiar streetlights and turning the world outside into a featureless void. It swirled with a malevolent intelligence, muffling all sound. A sudden, sharp scream cut through the silence. It was high-pitched, filled with a terror that was profoundly inhuman. Everyone froze. Agos was on his feet in an instant, his happy-go-lucky demeanor vanishing, replaced by a hardened, professional alertness. Fernanda's hand instinctively went to the holstered revolver at her hip. Another sound followed, the unmistakable shatter of glass. Then a chorus of panicked shouts from down the street, choked off abruptly. They were replaced by a wet, tearing noise that made the stomach churn. "Franco, lock the door," Fernanda commanded, her voice low and steady. Before he could move, the front door burst open with a crash. A man, it was Miller, the town baker, his apron drenched in something dark and steaming, stumbled in. His eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond sanity. One of his arms was gone, sheared off at the shoulder. Blood pumped from the ghastly wound, spattering the checkered linoleum floor. He took 2 lurching steps, his gaze finding Franco's. "The fog," he rasped, blood bubbling on his lips. "It has mouths. It has teeth. Hell has opened its gates over Samhain." He collapsed face first onto the floor and lay still. For a moment, the only sound was the frantic ticking of the wall clock. Then the lights flickered twice and died, plunging the diner into near total darkness. A woman in a booth let out a terrified sob. "Nobody panic!" Franco's voice cut through the fear. He moved with practiced ease through the dark, his hands finding the emergency candles he kept under the bar. Soon, a handful of flickering flames pushed back the oppressive darkness, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The cafe, once a beacon of warmth, now felt like a tomb, the candlelight illuminating faces pale with fear. The scene was surreal. A dead man lay pooling blood on the floor. Outside, a monstrous fog held a town of screaming souls hostage. Inside, the survivors sat huddled in the flickering gloom. Franco, ever the host, moved automatically, pouring coffee, setting out a basket of bread and a plate of cold cuts. "We must eat," he said softly. "Keep our strength." A group quickly gathered around the largest table, a strange collection of unwilling castaways. Franco, the anchor, Fernanda, the law, Agios, the muscle, and Ronald, the enigma. The 2 old fishermen and the sobbing couple huddled in a separate booth, praying in hushed tones. And in the corner, untouched and unnervingly calm, sat Samoth. "What in God's name is happening?" Agios demanded, running a hand through his thick auburn hair. He'd seen a lot on movie sets and in the gutters of his profession, but this was something else. "I've never heard screams like that." "The legends," one of the old fishermen whispered, his voice trembling. "They always said Samhain wasn't built on the land. It was built over something old and hungry that wakes when the stars are wrong." Fernanda shook her head, though her conviction wavered. "There has to be a rational explanation. A chemical spill from the old mill? Mass hysteria?" "Did mass hysteria tear off Miller's arm?" Agios replied, his voice grim. It was Ronald Richardson who spoke next, his precise English accent cutting cleanly through the fear-thickened air. He had closed his book and was looking directly at the fog-choked windows. "This is no industrial accident. The Elder Futhark runes speak of such phenomena. A hem mist, a blood fog, that serves as a veil between worlds. It doesn't just hide the monsters, it is the monster, or at least the medium through which they travel." They all stared at him. "Runes? Worlds?" Fernanda asked, skeptical. "What are you, some kind of mad historian?" "Of a sort," Ronald said evasively. "I study rare and forgotten histories." His gaze, and then everyone else's, drifted to the figure in the corner booth. Samoth hadn't moved. He hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken, hadn't shown a flicker of fear. He was simply watching them, his dark eyes gleaming in the candlelight, that small, knowing smirk still playing on his lips. He was enjoying this. Agios stood up, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards the silent man. "You know," Agios said conversationally, though his fists were clenched, "it's funny. You walk in, and all hell breaks loose. A man might think that's more than a coincidence." Samoth finally tilted his head. His voice, when he spoke, was a dry, rasping whisper, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Coincidence is a comforting illusion for small minds." A chill, colder than the winter air outside, snaked down Franco's spine. This was it. This was the source. "What do you want?" Fernanda asked, her hand now resting firmly on the butt of her gun. Sameth's smirk widened into a grotesque grin, showing yellow, uneven teeth. "What I want is a key, a very old key, bound in human skin and inked in blood. A travel guide, you might say." Ronald Richardson's face went white. "Dear God," he whispered, "he can't mean—" "Oh, but I do, Mr. Richardson," Sameth hissed, his gaze locking onto the Englishman. He seemed to grow in his seat, the shadows clinging to him, making him appear larger, less human. This town's founders were foolish. They sought knowledge, but feared its application. They locked the greatest secret in the world in the most mundane of places. The Samhain Public Library. I want the book. "What book?" Franco demanded. "He means the Necronomicon," Ronald said, his voice taut with a dreadful certainty. "The Al-Azif." The name hung in the air, heavy and profane. The old fisherman crossed himself. "Give it to me," Sameth ordered, his voice taking on a new resonance, a commanding power that vibrated in their bones. "Give me the book, and I will persuade the mist to seek its nourishment elsewhere. Refuse, and this diner will be the last island of warmth on an earth swallowed by primordial hunger." There was a moment of charged silence. The choice was unthinkable. Sacrifice a book for their lives, but in doing so, unleash what unspeakable power upon the rest of the world? It was Franco, the cafe owner, the man who knew this town by its heartbeats and its appetites, who answered. He picked up a heavy, cast-iron skillet from the cold stovetop, its weight familiar and solid in his hand. "Get out of my place," he said, his voice a low growl. "We don't make deals with monsters in Samhain." Fernanda drew her service revolver, the click of the hammer being pulled back shockingly loud. "He's right. It's over." Ayos grinned, a flash of his old, reckless self. "You picked the wrong diner, pal." Sameth let out a cackle, a dry, insect-like sound. "Fools! You are food, nothing more." He lunged, not like a man, but like something jointed wrong. He moved with impossible speed, his fingers elongating into dark, glistening talons. But he had fundamentally misjudged his audience. He swiped for Franco, who brought the iron skillet down in a brutal, ringing arc that connected with Sameth's shoulder. There was a sickening crunch of bone. Ayos, using the stuntman's agility that was second nature to him, kicked a chair into Sameth's path, sending him stumbling. Fernanda fired. The .38 caliber bullet struck Sameth in the chest, not with a fleshy impact, but with a shower of black sparks, as if hitting old iron. It staggered him, but didn't stop him. Sameth shrieked, a sound of fury and pain, and a wave of shano erupted from him, knocking over tables and sending candles skittering. He turned on Fernanda, but before he could reach her, Ronald Richardson stood, his book held open. He wasn't reading. He was chanting, his voice low and powerful, speaking words in a guttural, ancient tongue that hurt the ears. "Na fluftagin ktemph, yog sothoth, punglun gluanath." A sigil, traced in the air by Ronald's finger, blazed with a brilliant silver-green light between him and Sameth. The creature recoiled, shielding its face and hissing as if burned. He looked at the four of them, the determined Italian with his crude weapon, the agile brawler, the armed policewoman, and the unassuming Englishman who spoke the forbidden language, and for the first time a look of genuine shock, even fear, crossed his face. He had expected frightened sheep. He had found wolves. With a final ear-splitting shriek of frustration, Sameth's form dissolved. He became a swirling vortex of shadow and greasy smoke, blasted backward through the diner door, which almost splintered from its hinges. He vanished into the waiting, hungry mist outside. For a long moment, the four of them stood panting in the wrecked, candle-lit diner, the body of the baker a grim reminder of the night's cost. The mist outside seemed to thin slightly, the terrible sounds receding to a distant, muffled echo. The immediate danger had passed. They looked at each other, no longer just a cop, a PI, a scholar, and a cook. They were the line. "He'll be back," Fernanda said, her voice shaking but firm. "Yes," Ronald agreed, closing his book, "and he will not be alone next time." Franco placed the skillet back on the counter. He looked around his violated sanctuary, then at the faces of his allies. The night was far from over. Outside, in the swirling mists of Samhain, the gates of hell remained ajar, and the fight for their town, and perhaps everything else, had only just begun. Chapter 2. The ghost of stale coffee and fear hung heavy in Franco's, a miasma that no amount of brewing could dispel. The cheerful red and white checkered tablecloths seemed to mock the four figures huddled at a corner booth, their reflections distorted in the polished chrome of the napkin dispenser. The café, once Franco Martel's sanctuary, now felt like a cage where a predator had left its scent. Samhain. The name was a foul taste in Franco's mouth. Since the creepy man's visit, the very shadows in Samhain seemed to have deepened, to have grown teeth. "He is not human," Franco said, his Italian accent thickening the words. He ran a hand through his dark hair, the gesture doing little to soothe the tremor within. His blue eyes, usually full of warm hospitality, were clouded with a dread he hadn't felt since the Great War. Across from him, Fernanda Vasquez, her police uniform immaculate despite the turmoil, nodded grimly. The lamplight caught the sharp, beautiful lines of her face, a face he remembered smiling as she served cannoli just a couple years ago. Whatever he is, he's a threat. The disappearances on the edge of town, they've tripled. No bodies, no traces. It's like the fog just swallows them. Her Spanish lilt was usually a comfort. Now it was strained, tight as a wire. Agios Sophia, the private investigator and ex-stuntman, leaned back, his handsome face set in a rare scowl. He cracked his knuckles, a sound like pistol shots in the tense silence. "So, we don't call the feds. We don't go to the chief. What do we do? Wait for this thing to come back for dessert?" It was Ronald Richardson who finally spoke, his voice a calm, clipped English counterpoint to the group's rising panic. He adjusted his silk tie, a dapper anchor in a sea of chaos. "We require an expert, someone for whom these occurrences are not myth, but methodology." All eyes turned to him. "And you know such a person in this town?" Fernanda asked, a sliver of hope in her voice. "I know of one," Ronald corrected. "Keiko Ikari. Her family has resided here for generations, though they keep to themselves. Their business, Ikari Industries, is merely a facade. Their true work is pest control of a rather esoteric nature." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Her mansion is on the old gilded bluff overlooking the sea. If anyone has a strategy for dealing with a creature like Samhain, it is she." The decision was unspoken but unanimous. The oppressive quiet of the café was no longer a refuge. It was a tomb in waiting. The journey to the Ikari mansion was a descent into the frigid heart of Samhain's darkness. Agios's outrageously modified six-wheeler Duesenberg rumbled through the town's cobbled streets, past the imposing federal-style buildings and Greek revival facades that looked like mausoleums in the omnipresent mist and failing light. As they left the town center, the forest closed in, a gallery of skeletal, claw-like branches draped in a thick, wet mist. "Creepy," Agios muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel of his sturdy vehicle. "I've done night shoots and haunted backlots that felt cheerier than this." Franco stared out the window, as afforded by his passenger seat, watching the oppressive woods slide by. He felt it, a palpable malevolence pressing in on the formidable car, a low hum of animosity that vibrated in his teeth. It was Samhain's influence, seeping into the very land. He absently panicked at the thought of a breakdown in such an oppressive atmosphere, before forcibly getting control of himself. Fernanda in the back seat had her hand resting on the butt of her service revolver, her gaze sweeping the impenetrable gloom. "I feel like we are being watched. Dios mío, it's everywhere." "Stay focused," Ronald said softly beside her, his composure an unnerving island of calm. "It feeds on fear. Do not give it purchase." They rounded a sharp bend, the tires crunching on icy gravel, and Aegis slammed on the brakes. The Duesenberg, more a battlefield armored car, a luxury car, skidded to a halt, its array of headlamps illuminating an impassable barrier. A massive, ancient oak had fallen across the narrow road, its trunk as thick as a man is tall. It hadn't just fallen. It looked torn from the earth, the roots ripped out in a raw, violent wound. "Well, that's that," Agios said, his happy-go-lucky demeanor fraying. Though a pair of punt guns ran along the front fenders of his beast of a car, they weren't going to be able to blast through an oak. He sighed. "We walk from here?" "No," Franco said, his eyes narrowed. Something was wrong. The wood of the fallen tree was unnaturally black, slick, not with rain, but with a substance that seemed to absorb the light. There was no sound, no birds, no wind, not even the scuttling of unseen creatures. The silence was absolute, a crushing weight. This is a trap. As he spoke, a low whisper slithered through the car's cabin, a sibilant hiss that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a language of words, but of pure, distilled terror. It promised cold, damp earth and the endless patience of the grave. Fernanda gasped, her face pale. Agios swore, his bravado finally cracking. Even Ronald's impeccable facade wavered, a flicker of raw alarm in his eyes. Fear began working its magic as it seeped through the cracks of the armored car as surely as did the surrounding mist. Agios started to remember his nightmare flight from Smyrna, the entire city aflame. Fernanda started to whisper to a mist-formed and grotesquely distorted death mask of her poor mother who had died just months earlier, while Ronald's mind was suddenly cast back to the trenches of the Great War, watching friends choke up their lungs on mustard gas. Franco felt a cold dread snake up his spine, but with it came a surge of anger. He would not cower in a car while this evil toyed with them. "Basta!" he roared, the word a raw-throated defiance. He threw open his door, stepping out into the biting cold. "We go around, now!" His sudden action broke the spell. Galvanized, the others scrambled out. They plunged into the tree line, the undergrowth grabbing at their clothes like desperate hands. The whispering intensified, curling around their names, promising their deepest fears. For a terrifying 10 minutes, they stumbled through the oppressive dark, the feeling of unseen eyes boring into their backs, until they broke through the trees and found the road again on the other side. They didn't look back. They walked the remaining mile in tense silence, the only sound their ragged breaths misting in the frigid air, until at last, through the swirling fog, they saw it. Perched on the cliff's edge, the Ikari mansion was a stunning fusion of Gilded Age opulence and stark Japanese minimalism. It was all gingerbread trim and sweeping gambrel roofs, but the gardens were raked sand and stone, and the massive oak doors were adorned with a single, intricate brass shimenawa. A warm, golden light shone from its windows, a beacon of defiant sanctuary. The interior of the mansion was a whisper of shoji screens and polished dark wood, the air scented with green tea and old paper. A silent, severe butler had led them through halls lined with samurai armor and delicate inkwash paintings into a grand wood-paneled games room. The transition from the hostile cold outside to this cocoon of warmth and tranquility was dizzying. A low, melancholic jazz tune drifted from a gramophone in the corner, a saxophone weaving a lonely, beautiful melody. In the center of the room, under a low-hanging green-shaded lamp, stood Keiko Ikari. She was younger than Franco had expected, perhaps not even 30. She was arrestingly pretty, with sharp, intelligent eyes that held a deep, ancient sadness. She wore a simple, elegant silk kimono, and held a billiard cue with the casual grace of a master. "Mr. Richardson," she said, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable authority. "It has been some time. Welcome. And you," she added, her haunted gaze sweeping over Franco, Fernanda, and Agios, "are the ones who have disturbed the shadow." There were no hysterics, no disbelief. Just a calm, tired acceptance that chilled Franco more than the whispers in the woods. "Please," Keiko said, gesturing to a tray of drinks on a nearby table. "Make yourselves comfortable. Stress is an indulgence we cannot afford, but a moment's respite is a necessity." For the next hour, they existed in a surreal bubble of normalcy. Agos, his confidence restored, engaged Keiko in a game of billiards. His flashy, stuntman-honed trick shots were met with her quiet, deadly precision. She moved around the table with an unnerving grace, sinking balls with effortless flicks of her wrist. Ronald swirled a glass of fine whiskey while puffing on a cigar, observing the game with an analyst's eye. Fernanda, initially tense, allowed the smooth jazz and the warmth of the room to uncoil the knots in her shoulders. Franco found himself leaning against the mahogany bar, a small glass of Amaro in his hand, the bitter herbs a familiar comfort. He watched Keiko. She was a paradox, a young woman burdened with a duty that should have belonged to someone ancient. Every calculated move at the table felt like a reflection of a larger, more dangerous game she was forced to play. The jazz record ended, the silence punctuated only by the soft click of billiard balls. Keiko sank the 8-ball into a corner pocket and carefully set her cue back in its rack. The cozy interlude was over. "Now," she said, her voice losing its gentle edge and taking on the hardness of forged steel. "Tell me everything you know about the entity you call Samoth." They gathered in her study, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled not just with books, but with scrolls, artifacts, and strange, unsettling objects preserved in glass jars. A large map of Samhain and its environs was spread across a lacquered table. They spoke in turns, their voices low and urgent. Franco described the man's unnatural presence in his cafe. Fernanda detailed the pattern of dead bodies they had seen. Agos recounted the feeling of being hunted in the woods. Ronald provided what little relevant lore he had gathered over the years. Whispers of a thing that walks in the thin places between worlds, a being that feeds on despair and memory. Keiko listened without interruption, her fingers steepled before her lips. When they were finished, she stood and walked to the map, her small frame casting a long shadow. "He is not a ghost or a simple demon," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "He is older. In my family's texts, such things are called yomi no kage, a shadow from the underworld. They are not meant to be here. Something has weakened the barrier, or he was summoned." She tapped a finger on a location deep within the forest, not far from where the tree had blocked their path. "These things have anchors, a place where their connection to this world is strongest. a place of great sorrow or violence. Samoth is not just wandering. He is establishing a territory, a feeding ground, your town. "So, what do we do?" Fernanda asked, her voice a near whisper. "How do we fight a shadow?" Keiko turned to face them, and for the first time, Franco saw a flicker of something beyond her haunted composure. It was a cold, burning fire of resolve. "You do not fight a shadow by punching it," she said, her gaze meeting Agios's. "You do not arrest it," she added, looking at Fernanda. "And you cannot simply wish it away." Her eyes fell on Franco. "You must find its anchor and sever its connection. You starve it of its power at the source." She pointed to a glass case on the wall. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was a beautifully crafted tanto dagger, its blade seeming to shimmer with an inner light. "My family has fought these things for centuries. We have the tools and the knowledge, but I am one person." Her dark, haunted eyes met each of theirs in turn, weighing them, measuring them. "The Yomi no Kage is clever. It isolates its prey. It thrives on division. But it has made a mistake. It has chosen a cafe owner who cares for his people, a police officer who will not abandon her duty, a fighter who does not know how to quit, and a scholar who knows the value of old secrets." She let the silence hang for a moment, thick with the unsaid weight of their new reality. "It has inadvertently created a fellowship," Keiko Ikari concluded, her voice now a low, dangerous promise. "And that is something even a shadow can learn to fear." The cozy warmth of the mansion felt 1,000,000 miles away as the fellowship walked back to Agio's vehicle. The jazz was long forgotten as they passed through the misty forest, guided by flashlights and the occasional sliver of moonlight that fought its way through. Ignoring all manner of ghost calls and will-o'-the-wisps begging them to stray from their path, the intrepid quartet, now galvanized by Keiko's revelations, soon reached the hulking form of Agios Black Duesenberg, its array of white crucifix decals somehow fitting. Climbing in and out of the bitter cold and strange stench, Samhain's winter pressed against the glass, but inside, a plan, fragile and terrifying, was beginning to form. The game of cat and mouse was over. They were no longer either. The true hunt had begun, and they were as a pack of wolves. Chapter 3. The stale, metallic scent of urgency and old paper hung heavy in the air of Franco's back office. Keiko Ikari's final words, delivered in a breathless, fading whisper, seemed to pulse in the dim candlelight, a sacred charge against the encroaching dark. "The key is duality," she had said, her dark eyes glazed with pain, but burning with conviction. "My blood holds the formula, a sacred geometry of banishment. But to cage a god, you need the cage itself. You need the original text, the Necronomicon. He will seek it himself. You must get to the library first." Ronald Richardson, ever the composed Englishman, was the first to break the stunned silence. He bit his lip and adjusted his cuffs, a nervous tick betraying his calm exterior. "Get to the library? Of course. Samhain's archive is unique. It predates the town itself. It holds things other institutions would burn." "Sameth knows about the library's wards and protections. That's why he tried to get us to get it for him," Fernanda said, her voice tight. Her police training battled with the sheer surreal horror of it all. "But he could find some way in, right? He's not just some creepy guy. He's after a book to become a god, and we're the only ones standing in his way." Agio Sophia cracked his knuckles, the sound like gunshots in the small room. The happy-go-lucky stuntman was gone, replaced by a grim warrior. Then we don't let him get it. Simple. We go, we get the book, we shove it down his throat along with whatever Ikari gave us. Franco said nothing. He looked from the blood-stained handkerchief Keiko had used to trace the strange, angular symbol onto a napkin, a diagram that seemed to drink the light around it, to the antique tanto dagger she had pressed into his hands. Its hilt was cold, a serious, deadly weight. His café, his sanctuary of espresso, cannoli, and pizza pie, had become a war room in a war he never enlisted in. He met Fernanda's eyes, saw the tension and the resolve there, and gave a single sharp nod. "Then let's go find this book," he said, his Italian accent thickening with emotion. "Andiamo, before the mist gets any more murderous." Indeed, as if to punctuate his sentence, a sustained chill scream carried over the breeze from anyone's guess where. The short walk to Samhain's Mysticanoma University, in where the library stood, was a journey through a waking nightmare. The oppressive winter cold had taken on a sentient quality, and the mist coiled through the streets like searching tendrils. It wasn't natural. It was a thick, gray soup that deadened sound and distorted vision. Shadows moved within it, not cast by anything, but living, pulsing things that slithered just at the corner of the eye. The classic Federal and Greek Revival homes lining the streets were now monolithic tombstones in a city of the dead. Fernanda led the way, her service revolver drawn, her police-issue flashlight doing little to pierce the supernatural gloom. Agios flanked the rear, a tire iron he'd grabbed from his car held like a broadsword, his eyes constantly scanning the shifting fog. Ronald navigated with an unnerving certainty, using a glossy walking cane to test the ground before him as if he'd walked similar mist-choked paths before. "It's a thaumaturgic fog," Ronald murmured, his breath pluming white. "A manifestation of his will. Kind of reminds me of Ypres. He's looking for us. He's looking for it." They reached the library steps. The grand columned building, usually a beacon of quiet knowledge, was now a mausoleum. The mist swirled thickest here, lapping against the heavy oak doors like a gray tide. The doors were unlocked. Inside, the silence was absolute and heavy. The great reading room was a canyon of shadows, the towering bookshelves looming like cliffs. The few lamps that were on cast weak, jaundiced pools of light, making the darkness between them seem all the more profound. The air was frigid and carried the dank, sweet smell of rotten mulch and river bottom. "This way," Ronald whispered, heading not for the main catalog, but toward a nondescript door marked Head Librarian, Private. "The Esoterica collection isn't on any public record." He produced a set of lockpicks from his waistcoat with a flourish that seemed practiced, and within seconds the lock clicked open. The room beyond was a cramped, windowless office, dominated by a huge, scarred desk. But Ronald went straight to the largest bookcase behind it. He ran his fingers along the ornate wooden trim, pressed a specific carved rosette, and with a soft groan, a whole section of the bookcase swung inward, revealing a narrow, descending staircase. A wave of cold, dry, ancient air washed over them. "Bloody hell," Agios breathed. "After you," Ronald said, his face grim. The stairs led down to a vault. It was cold and silent, a circular room lined not with wood, but with sleek, dark metal. The air hummed with a low, sub-audible frequency that set their teeth on edge. In the center of the room, on a pedestal of polished black stone, rested a book. It was larger than any tome had a right to be, bound in a mottled, flesh-like material that seemed to gleam faintly under their flashlight beams. Its cover was etched with spiraling, non-Euclidean designs that hurt to look at for too long. There were no words on the cover, but they all knew its name. The Necronomicon. "Don't touch it directly," Ronald warned, pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket. "The binding is reactive. That's why it is kept down here. It needs moisture. As he reached for it, the hum in the room intensified into a deafening vibration. The metal walls began to ring like a struck bell. Thump. The sound came from the top of the stairs. A heavy, deliberate footstep. Thump. Another. Closer. The mist began to pour down the staircase, a cascading waterfall of gray, churning vapor that spilled across the vault floor, hiding it from view. It moved with purpose, coalescing in the center of the room. And from the mist, Samhain emerged. He was no longer just a creepy man. He had grown, his form stretching, becoming gaunt and impossibly tall. His skin was the color and texture of the mist itself, and his eyes were voids of absolute blackness. He smiled, and his mouth was a rift of jagged shadows. "The librarians are gone," he rasped, his voice the sound of crumbling tombstones and whispering insects. "Their due has been paid. The book is mine. You are merely the delivery." Fernanda didn't hesitate. She raised her revolver and fired twice. The reports were deafening in the enclosed space. The bullets struck his chest and vanished into the mist of his form without effect. He didn't even flinch. Agios roared, charging forward with the tire iron. He swung it with all his stuntman strength at Samhain's head. The iron passed through him with a sound like tearing silk, and Agios stumbled, crying out as a freezing numbness shot up his arms. Samhain backhanded him without seeming to move. Agios was lifted off his feet and thrown against the metal wall with a sickening crunch, slumping to the floor, motionless. "Agios!" Fernanda screamed, stunned by the level of sorcery Samhain commanded. Ronald stood his ground, the silk-wrapped Necronomicon held to his chest. "You cannot have it, Samhain," Ronald shouted, finally recognizing an old foe behind this stranger's mask. "This town is not your gateway." Samhain's shadowy smile widened. "Hello, Ronald. Still playing the hunter? You failed in London. You failed in Cairo. You will fail here." He glided forward, the mist following him like a royal cloak. Franco had been frozen, the Tonto dagger cold in his hand. He saw Agios broken on the floor. He saw Fernanda desperately trying to reload. He saw Ronald standing defiant but hopeless before an ancient horror. This thing had invaded his town, his home, threatened his people. A cold, clean fury washed over him, burning away the fear. As Samhain reached for Ronald, Franco moved. He wasn't a fighter, he was a cafe owner, but he knew precision. He knew how to move in a busy kitchen, how to find the exact space to be. He dodged a slithering tendril of mist and plunged the Tonto dagger forward, not at the misty chest, but at the place where a man's heart would be. The blade, inscribed with Keiko's sacred geometries, glowed hungrily as it met resistance. A sickening, grating resistance, as if he were stabbing petrified wood. Samhain froze. A shocked, silent snarl contorted his features. He looked down at the ornate hilt protruding from his chest. Where the blade entered, his mist-like form began to solidify, turning a sickly, concrete gray. The darkness in his eyes flickered. An knife?" he gurgled, the voice losing its omnipotence, becoming merely strange and wet. A mortal? Knife?" Franco leaned in, his face inches from the creature's. He could smell the river-bottom stench on him. All the fear, the stress, the violation of his peaceful life condensed into a single, potent act of contempt. He spat directly into Samoth's face. The spit sizzled on the creature's skin like acid. It was the final, mundane, human insult that broke the supernatural spell. Samoth screamed, a high-pitched, tearing sound of pure rage and agony. The gray solidification spread from the wound like a virus, cracking his form. The mist in the room recoiled, swirling violently. Ronald saw his chance. He dropped the silk-wrapped book onto the pedestal and snatched the blood-stained napkin from his pocket. He slammed it, symbol down, onto the cover of the Necronomicon. The reaction was instantaneous. A light, pure and white and silent, exploded from the book. It wasn't a light that illuminated. It was a light that unmade. It filled the vault, and the screaming mist, the swirling darkness, and the crumbling form of Samoth were drawn into it like water down a drain. The light consumed the shadows, the cold, the hatred. It filled every crack, every corner, and then, with a final soft pop of pressure equalizing, it was gone. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound Franco had ever heard. It was the simple, quiet silence of a room. The vault was just a vault. The humming had stopped. The mist had vanished. Agios groaned, pushing himself up against the wall, clutching his ribs. The terrible cold was replaced by the ordinary chill of a basement. On the floor lay a desiccated, brittle husk, like a long-dead insect, with the Tonto dagger still buried in its chest. It was small, insignificant. Franco placed a foot on its chest and wrenched the blade free. He looked down at the remains of the thing that had called itself Samoth and felt nothing but a weary disgust. "It is done," Ronald said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. He carefully folded the silk over the now inert Necronomicon. The cage held. Fernanda rushed to Agios, helping him to his feet. "You're okay? You're really okay?" "Yeah, kid," he grunted, a ghost of his old smile returning. "Just gotta remember to duck next time." They stumbled up the stairs and out of the library. They stood on the steps, blinking in the pale winter morning sun. The mist was gone. The oppressive weight had lifted. The town of Samhain looked exactly as it always had. The gambrel roofs dusted with frost, the Gilded Age mansions standing quiet and proud. But it felt different. It felt clean. The cleanup would be long. There were stories to concoct, injuries to explain, a strange body to dispose of. But for now, they stood together, the cafe owner, the police officer, the PI, and the mysterious Englishman, watching the sun rise over their town. Franco put an arm around Fernanda, pulling her close. He looked at his friends, battered but alive. He thought of his cafe, waiting for him to turn on the lights and brew the first espresso of the day. "Allora," Franco said, taking a deep, clean breath of the morning air, "I think we are open for business."